Everyone knows where Native Americans came from. Siberia, land bridge, ice age, done. It's one of the most settled questions in archaeology, except it isn't. Because when scientists actually sat down and compared the DNA, tribe by tribe, gene by gene, they found something that broke the model completely. One group of people in the Americas carries genetic material that has no business being there. Not from Siberia, not from East Asia. Scientists have been quietly arguing about this for a decade, and the answer they've landed on is stranger than anything the textbooks prepared us for. Let's start with what we thought we knew, because the story only gets interesting once you understand how solid the foundation seemed. About 15 to 20,000 years ago, sea levels were dramatically lower than today. The Bering Strait, that stretch of water between Alaska and Russia, didn't exist. In its place was a massive landmass that scientists call Beringia, not a narrow bridge, as the name implies, but a continent unto itself, wide, grassy, cold, but not uninhabitable. And people lived there. Populations from what is now Siberia gradually drifted east, following animals, following seasons, following whatever it is that drives human beings to keep moving when there's still more land ahead. Eventually, some of them crossed into the Americas. Or rather, the Americas were already part of their world, and they just kept walking. The ice sheets retreated, sea levels rose, and suddenly those people were cut off from the old world, isolated, and from that founding population, every indigenous person in North and South America descended. That's the model. It's clean, it's elegant, and the genetics largely support it. The early studies were remarkable in their consistency. You could take DNA from a Lakota elder in South Dakota and compare it to a Chukchi herder in northeastern Siberia, and the relationship was unmistakable. Shared haplogroups. That's what geneticists call the clusters of genetic markers that track like fingerprints across generations. Native Americans carried haplogroups A, B, C, D, and X, and when you looked for those in the Old World, the strongest matches were always in northeastern Asia, Siberia, Mongolia. The genetic signal pointed like a compass east to west, Asia to America, ancestors to descendants. And then, there was the Malta boy. In 1928, near Lake Baikal in Siberia, archaeologists found the remains of a child. They called the site Malta. The child had been buried with jewelry, with figurines, with care. He lived about 24,000 years ago, which means he was walking the earth during the height of the last ice age. For decades, he was just an interesting archaeological find. Then in 2013, scientists extracted his DNA. What they found was shocking. The Malta boy, scientists call him MA1, was genetically related to both Western Eurasians and to Native Americans, not to East Asians. To people from the western part of Eurasia, related to the ancestors of Europeans. This made no immediate sense. How did DNA from the western end of a continent end up in a child buried near the center of Siberia and then somehow also appear in Native Americans? The answer, as best as scientists can reconstruct it, is that ancient Siberia was more genetically diverse than anyone expected. The population that eventually crossed into the Americas wasn't purely East Asian. They carried ancestry from this older, more Western-derived population, sometimes called ancient North Eurasians. And that's why Native Americans carry a faint but unmistakable genetic echo of something that looks almost European, even though no European ever set foot in the ancient Americas. It was there from the beginning, baked into the founding population before they ever crossed Beringia. That discovery rewrote the model, but it still fit within a framework: complicated Siberian ancestry, land bridge crossing, isolation, the Americas. The system could absorb it. What the system could not absorb was what came next. In 2015, a team of researchers published a paper in the journal Nature. The lead author was Pontus Skoglund, working out of Harvard. The team had been doing something painstaking and slow, collecting DNA from indigenous populations across South America, populations that had rarely been studied, populations from deep in the Amazon basin. The Surui, the Caritiana, the Zavante, small, isolated communities. some with limited contact with the outside world even today. When the team ran the genetic analysis, they expected to find what everyone had always found, the standard Siberian-derived ancestry that defines Native American DNA. What they found instead stopped them cold. Certain Amazonian populations carried a genetic signal faint, but statistically unmistakable that was not Siberian. It was not East Asian. It was not ancient North Eurasian. When the computers ran the comparisons, the closest matches to this mystery signal were indigenous Australians and Melanesians. People from the other side of the world, separated from South America by the entire Pacific Ocean. The researchers named this mystery population Population Y. The Y stands for Yipicuera, a word from the Tupi language meaning ancestor. And Population Y accounted for roughly 2% of the ancestry in certain Amazonian groups, a minority signal, but real, reproducible. Something that multiple independent research teams have since confirmed. So now the question becomes, how does DNA resembling indigenous Australians end up in the Amazon? There are several theories, and scientists are still fighting about which one is right. The first possibility is that Population Y was simply part of the diversity of ancient Asia. Maybe 20,000 years ago, before the crossing into the Americas, there were populations in East or Southeast Asia that looked genetically similar to the ancestors of Australians, and one branch of those people made it to Beringia and crossed over. The Australian resemblance would then be a coincidence of shared ancient ancestry, not evidence of direct contact across the Pacific. The second possibility is more dramatic, that there were multiple crossings into the Americas from different source populations at different times. Maybe one group crossed the land bridge and gave rise to most Native Americans, and separately, maybe another group carrying that Australasian-like DNA arrived by a different route, possibly along the coastline of the Pacific, island hopping or following kelp forest ecosystems that provided food and shelter along the coasts of Asia and North America. This coastal migration hypothesis has gained serious momentum in recent years, partly because it would explain a lot of anomalies in the archaeological record. The third possibility is the wildest, and the one that excites the most speculation, while also drawing the most skepticism, that Population Y reached South America by crossing the Pacific directly from Australia or Melanesia. The distances are enormous, the technology seems insufficient, but then again, the Pacific was crossed. Polynesians did it. The real question is whether anyone did it earlier and whether they left descendants. Here's where the story branches in an unexpected direction, because Population Y isn't the only anomaly in the Native American genetic record. Around the same time as the Skoglund paper, researchers were also puzzling over another strange data point. When scientists analyzed ancient DNA from very early Americans, people who lived 10, 11, 12,000 years ago, they found that these ancient individuals were genetically distinct from many modern Native American populations. Not entirely separate, but different enough to suggest that the early Americas were more genetically diverse than the populations that survive today. There was a baby boy buried in Montana about 12,600 years ago. He was found at a site called Anzac, and his remains were surrounded by more than 100 Clovis tools, the distinctively shaped stone points that represent the earliest clearly defined archaeological culture in the Americas. Scientists extracted his DNA. They named him the Anzac Child, and his genome showed that he was related to all modern Native Americans, but that he was particularly closely related to Central and South American populations rather than North American ones. Which was unexpected because the Clovis culture had always been assumed to represent a population that spread south, not one that was already somehow more southern in its affinities. The picture that emerges from all of this is not one clean migration. It's a series of movements, multiple waves, different populations arriving at different times, from slightly different source populations in Asia, mixing and diverging and in some cases disappearing entirely, leaving only faint genetic traces in the groups that survived. And this is where the Kets come in. The Kets are a small indigenous people living along the Yenisei River in central Siberia. They're remarkable for several reasons, but the genetic one is this. Of all the Siberian peoples that have been studied, the Kets show the closest genetic affinity to a specific subset of Native Americans, namely, the Na-Dene-speaking peoples of North America. That includes the Navajo, the Apache, the Dene peoples of Alaska and Canada. The Na-Dene speakers arrived in the Americas later than the first wave. This is linguistically and genetically well established, and their closest Old World relatives are not in northeastern Siberia, where you'd expect the closest relatives to be. They're in the middle of Siberia, along a river. The Kets are a remnant population, a fragment of something larger that was once spread across Siberia and has since contracted dramatically. So you have the Kets in Siberia, whose closest relatives are Navajo people in Arizona. You have population Y in the Amazon, whose closest relatives are in Australia and Papua New Guinea. You have the ghost of ancient North Eurasians haunting both Siberian and Native American genomes, connecting them to something older and more Western. And you have early Americans who were genetically distinct from most of their supposed descendants. The Americas weren't settled once. They were settled in layers. And some of those layers are still visible in the DNA of living people, if you know how to look. What does this mean for our understanding of human history? At minimum, it means that ancient humans were more mobile, more adventurous, and more genetically diverse than we gave them credit for. The old story band of hunters crosses a land bridge, walks south, settles a continent isn't wrong, but it's dramatically incomplete. Human beings were navigating coastlines and crossing mountain ranges and interbreeding with populations they encountered in ways that we're only now beginning to trace through genetics. There's something almost humbling about this. We've spent a century building a clean narrative about where people came from, and the DNA keeps adding footnotes. Not contradictions exactly, but complications. Nuances, reminders that real history is always messier than the story we tell about it. The story of population Y isn't resolved. Scientists don't agree on how Australasian ancestry ended up in Amazonian tribes. The competing hypotheses are all still on the table, and the data isn't yet decisive enough to eliminate any of them. What is clear is that the standard model had a hole in it, and the hole has a shape. The shape looks like it came from far away. And until we know exactly where it came from and when, every piece of ancient DNA that gets analyzed is another data point, another clue, another chance to close in on an answer. The next generation of ancient DNA research is already underway. Scientists are extracting genetic material from remains in Colombia, in Brazil, in the Pacific Islands. They're building databases of ancient genomes that didn't exist 5 years ago. Every new sample has the potential to either confirm the current theories or break them entirely. In this field, the ground shifts constantly. What was settled last decade is provisional today. And maybe that's the most interesting thing about this story. Not just the specific mystery of population Y, or the Kets, or the ancient Beringians, but the broader truth it points to, that human beings have been moving and mixing and carrying pieces of each other's worlds across oceans and continents for tens of thousands of years, long before history, long before writing, long before anyone thought to record it. The DNA is the record. It just took us this long to learn to read it. If this kind of deep history is your thing, the kind where the science keeps pulling the rug out from under the story we thought we knew, then stay around, because there's a lot more where this came from. There are unsolved questions in ancient genetics that are just as strange as this one, and if you found yourself surprised by any of this today, drop what surprised you most in the comments. I genuinely want to know which part landed hardest. The population Y discovery still gets me every time. Something that looks Australian, buried in the genetic code of people living in the Amazon. That's not a footnote, that's a whole other story we haven't finished telling yet.